and Professor Chin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'd like to start off by thanking and you for inviting me to speak to the audience here and also the audience online. So I was told to give an update for this Malaysia update on what's happening in Sabah and Sarawak. So I'd like to start off by saying that I don't know why, but every time ANU asks me to come, they always ask me to talk only about Sabah and Sarawak. It must be something to do with the fact that I was born and raised in Sarawak. But anyway, so today, given the time constraints, I only talk about basically 5 topics. The one is the big picture. The second is the share of cabinet. As you know, people for the last few years have been talking about the rise of Sabah and Sarawak in the Malaysian political system. Then I'll talk about the opposition in the both states. Then, of course, you can't run away. If you want to talk about politics in Sabah and Sarawak, you can't run away from this thing called MA63, or the Malaysia Agreement, the historical grievances attached to MA63. Then I'll finish off by talking about a thing called the Borneo bloc, or the attempts to create a new political bloc in the Malaysian system. And this basically consists of Sabah and Sarawak coming together to challenge the Malayan political establishment. Right, so what is the big picture? I think it's really important that we understand the big picture before we look at Sabah and Sarawak. As my good friend says, Malaysia is now highly polarized. And the simplest example of that is that if you look at Parliament today, the 2 biggest blocs in Parliament consist of PAS, depending on how you count, is 43 members, or if you go by the actual people standing is 49. The second biggest bloc is DAP with 40 seats. Now, why is this important? Because these 2 sides are totally opposite. There is no common ground or no middle ground between these 2 parties. In terms of PAS, from day one, they've made it very clear they don't like the current constitution. They don't like this funny wording that says Islam is the religion of the Federation. They want to make it very clear that Malaysia is an Islamic state. In other words, they want to change the fundamental character of Malaysia. DAP, on the other side, is exactly opposite. They want Malaysia to be a liberal, secular state, one that believes in rights for every minority. Everybody is equal under the Malaysian sun. Basically, a liberal, laissez-faire Malaysia. So there's really no middle ground between these 2 groups, and this has never happened before in Malaysian politics. But what is even more interesting is that if you sort of step away, you can see that there's actually 3 narratives now. On top of this, you know, the narratives from the Malay ground who believes in Ketuhanan Melayu Islam, from Malay heartland, as Azmin was saying, they won the vote big time. DAP won mostly the urban votes. But now, coming in increasingly, you have the third narrative of what Malaysia is. And this is the narrative offered by the Borneo bloc, which is that saying that, you know, if you were really to look back at how the Federation of Malaysia came into being, Sabah and Sarawak should actually be regarded as the third leg for the Federation. And therefore, we want to be treated as equal partners. We do not want to be seen as, you know, something that just support the Malay establishment. We want a high level of autonomy, especially political autonomy, and we do not like the way that politics is being conducted in the peninsula. We want less of political Islam. We want to reiterate and reinforce the fact that the original vision for Malaysia is it is a multicultural, multi-religious society, and we really want to make sure that, you know, we are the constant reminder that it is possible in modern-day Malaysia to have this sort of society. The second part of the big picture that I want to share with you guys is that, as you know, for the last 3 federal elections up to 2018, right, since 2008, it's always been assumed that Sabah and Sarawak, especially Sarawak, are the kingmakers when it comes to forming the federal government. Unfortunately, in this election, they were not the kingmakers. If you look at the way the federal government was formed after 5 days, right, UMNO played a crucial vote. Basically, if UMNO had not swung towards Anwar Ibrahim would not have been able to form the federal government. So in this general election, I made the argument that they're no longer the most important bloc that came together to ensure that Anwar Ibrahim became the prime minister. Nevertheless, GPS is still an important bloc. They have 23 seats, but if they were to combine with GRS, then the Borneo bloc becomes quite important. Collectively, they consist of 31 seats. So in some ways, you can argue that even though they're not the kingmaker, you still need the bloc from Sabah and Sarawak to ensure their stability. So the way to understand is that the UMNO are the kingmakers, help Anwar Ibrahim get the majority. Sabah and Sarawak provides the 2/3 majority, the political stability are needed. One important footnote to this is that, as you know, right, for many, many years, the NGO and the civil society community in Malaysia has been pushing very much for the anti-hopping law, because they say one of the reasons we have political instability in Malaysia is because YBs or MPs keep jumping from party to party. So they successfully pushed for this law. But the downside of this law is that it actually makes it easier in some ways to pull down a government now. Because in the old days, you have to go and grab individual MPs to defect. Under the anti-hopping law, right, it is only halal to defect if the entire party defect. So now if I want to pull the government now, all I have to do is to make sure I capture the leader of UMNO and the leader of GPS, and they will bring the rest of the MPs along. See my point? So in some ways, it's actually easier to pull down a government. So in some ways, I'm sort of indirectly saying that not all reforms are good. Sometimes you have to be very careful what you ask for. Okay. So I'd like to add on to what my colleague was saying by adding a separate thing, which is that the rise of PAS is mainly confined to Peninsular Malaysia this time. So far, PAS has never been successful in Sabah and Sarawak. In fact, if you look at the record of PAS candidates in Sabah and Sarawak, in almost all cases, they lose the deposit. They can't even get the deposit back. However, because of the structure of the way politics is done in Peninsular Malaysia and the coalition, in Sabah, in the last state election, they were forced to give a PAS. Even though they lost, they were forced to give a seat to PAS in the Sabah Assembly. The Sabah Assembly is unique that they allows the ruling party to appoint 6 state assemblymen. So one of those 6 positions was given to the PAS leader in Sabah. So now PAS has a presence in the Dewan Undangan Negeri in Sabah for the very first time since independence. PAS is still very weak in Sarawak, and they have no presence in the Dewan Undangan Negeri Sarawak. Right. Secondly, share of Sabah Sarawak in the government. What did Sabah and Sarawak get out of the federal government under the Anwar Ibrahim administration? So if you look at the full ministers list, I'm not going to read through this. You'll find that Sarawak is the big winner when it comes to the formation of government. Even, as I mentioned earlier, they were not the kingmakers. They are actually the biggest winner. They end up with 5 full ministers, including for the very first time in Malaysia history, the Deputy Prime Ministership number 2. That was given to Sabah and Sarawak got it through a guy called Fadila Yusuf. Sabah, because they were, they could not get it together. They only ended up with 2 full federal ministership. But never mind, collectively, if you were to put them together, they constitute 25% of the federal cabinet. What is even more interesting, if you look at the list of deputy ministers in Malaysia, now this is really unprecedented. Almost half of the deputy ministers in the federal government come from Sabah and Sarawak. Okay, this has never happened before. So it's quite remarkable, Every weekend, half of the deputy ministers disappear from Putrajaya and they go back to Sabah Sarawak. I will not tell you what that means, because this is live. So, but you can see the big picture, right? 25% federal cabinet, Sabah Sarawak, 50% of the deputy ministers. Okay, so Sabah and Sarawak, in summary, has the biggest contingent in the federal Malaysian cabinet since independence, plus the symbolic 1 deputy prime minister. Okay. In addition, of course, they'll get more representatives on government bodies, statutory boards, and GLCs. The only area where they have lost out is in the Dewan Rakyat. As many of you will remember, when Najib was the prime minister, he gave Sabah and Sarawak the speaker of the Dewan Rakyat, plus both deputies were from Sabah and Sarawak. This time, Sabah Sarawak only have the deputy speakership, Alice Lau, the MP from Cebu. So politically, a big win for Sarawak, maybe slightly less for Sabah. Okay. So moving on, the opposition in Sabah and Sarawak. It is my argument that there is no real opposition left in Sabah and Sarawak. Officially on paper, there were 2 MPs who belongs to Muhyiddin's party, Bersatu, one in Sabah, Serato Ali Biju, and one in Sabah, in Belorang seat, okay? That is in theory. The reason why I say in theory is because these 2 people, if there were no anti-hopping law, they will quite happily join one of the Sabah-based party, and the other one will quite happily join GPS. But because under the anti-hopping law, right, if they were to jump now, they will lose their seats. So that's the reason why officially on paper, they belong to a West Malaysian party. But in their heart, I'm quite sure they are with the parties in Sabah and Sarawak, okay? So what you have now is a funny situation where in Sarawak, the parties that are part of the federal government, Pakatan Harapan, is actually an opposition at the state level. So in Sarawak, the governing party is GPS, and they refuse to give any seats in the government to any members of the to the Pakatan Harapan parties. So there is no representatives, for example, from PKR or DAP in the Sarawak government. Okay? So you can imagine, right, when they did the deal with the federal government, even though they said we support Anwar Ibrahim, the Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim did not ask for his own party people in Sarawak to be included in the Sarawak government. So this shows you the leverage GPS has, okay? Now, in the case of Sabah, it's slightly different. It was only from this year, January this year, that Pakatan Harapan was formally admitted into the Sabah government. So from November and December last year after the election, they were cut off from the state government as well. Okay? So I expect there will be no real opposition in Sabah and Sarawak for the foreseeable future unless something happens at the federal level. So coming back to the core issue when it comes to MA63, what can we expect in the short term? Right now, we're hearing a lot of positive noises from Anwar Ibrahim. He's saying that I'm going to resolve most of the MA63 historical grievances that were not resolved in the last 2 or 3 administrations. And in fact, he has gone on public saying that he has put the Deputy Prime Minister from Sarawak, Fadillah Yusof, he has put him in charge of MA63 issue. Now, this is really, really interesting for somebody like me because there's actually a special cabinet position given to Aziman from Sabah. He's actually the minister in charge of Sabah Sarawak affairs. So it's quite interesting that now you have both 2 ministers who are looking specifically at MA63 issues, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister in charge of Sabah Sarawak affairs. Okay, so the hope is that both of them are actually working towards the same goal. So what can we expect? So I expect Anwar Ibrahim to approve more decentralization. In other words, more and more administrative powers will be handed back to Sabah and Sarawak. In the case of Sabah, they've been asking for 40% return of all the taxes or money raised from Sabah. This is actually written in the constitution. So I expect Anwar Ibrahim to approve the payment. The formula has already been given to the cabinet, but they haven't announced what is the results of the formula. But what I expect them to do is actually to make the payment to Sabah in stages because they can't afford to pay the 40% one go. Because the idea is that you have to pay the 40% calculated from 1973. So, because they said, the MA63 thing, you never kept to your word, and therefore you've got to accumulate all this, right? Just as a footnote, right, the reason why the Sabahans are so passionate about this is because one of the constant complaints you hear from the people of Sabah and Sarawak is that everything you see in Kuala Lumpur nowadays, all the iconic things, North-South Highway, Petronas Tower, KLIL, all this was built with money from the oil and gas resources in Sarawak. So in other words, we were underdeveloped since the 1970s because the money was siphoned off. So when you ask for 40% backdated all the way to 1973, it's only fair, right? But we also know the federal government do not have the money. So it is my understanding that even if the money will be paid, it will be paid in stages. It won't be one block. The other thing they're pushing very hard in terms of, remember I said that they wanted to be treated as equal partners. So the argument is that, we wanted to be treated as equal partners and we want 1/3 share of the seats in parliament, okay? So the argument is that politics in Peninsular Malaysia or Malaya has gone haywire. There's too much religious stuff, there's too much political Islam, there's too much ethnic tensions. We need the 1/3 constitutional guarantee because as you know, right, under the Malaysian system, if you want to amend the constitution, you need 2/3 majority. So you basically give the people of Sabah, Sarawak the veto power if they have 1/3. Now, it depends on who you speak to. Some people say that cabinet has agreed. Some people say cabinet has not agreed. But whatever it is, nothing will happen for the next 2 years because you need to redraw the constituencies. And the next one will be done in 2026. So we will know whether they're really going to deliver this 1/3 seats in 2026. As you know, right, 24 hours is a long time in Malaysian politics. So I will not guess which way the wind will be blowing on this issue. The other thing they're asking for is constitutional amendment. They want to cement certain parts of the constitution to make sure that Sabah and Sarawak are guaranteed autonomy. It is my argument that this will not happen for at least for the next 2 years. So even if Anwar is in power, he will not push for any more constitution amendment because based on my few interviews, it's quite clear that the Malay political establishment has no more appetite to give additional concessions to Sabah and Sarawak. They think that we've already given you enough concession. You have to, stay where you are for the next couple of years. So the big thing now, right? The big argument now is actually through a thing called the PDA. As you know, the richest pot of gold in Malaysia is this thing called Petronas. And the unique thing about Petronas is that Petronas as a GLC in Malaysia is unique. It's unique because the way the rules of setting up Petronas, the reason why it's unique is that Petronas only reports to the Prime Minister. Okay, this is really unique among all the GLCs. You can ask people who study GLC, they'll tell you that Petronas is unique, that it only answers to the Prime Minister. So remember what I said about Sabah and Sarawak? They said that the oil and gas belongs to them. So Sabah and Sarawak want to tap back oil and gas, and they said that we want to renegotiate PDA, which in my opinion is not possible. The reason is that the dividends given by the Petronas to the federal government is crucial for the developmental aspects of the Malaysian budget. So there is no way the federal government is going to give oil and gas resources back to Sabah and Sarawak. And it's also because of that this thing called state nationalism in Sabah and Sarawak will still remain very strong because you can't give this back. There's no way the federal government can give this back. So what we see in the coming years is that you will see increasingly Petronas will be forced to negotiate with the governments of Sabah and Sarawak in terms of downstreaming activities. So in the case of Sarawak, they've set up their own oil company called Petros. And in Sabah, what they did was that they copied directly from Sarawak. They created a thing called SMJ Petroleum. So the idea was that you have state-based oil company who take care of all the downstreaming process from the national oil company Petronas. So all the Petronas subsidiary in West Malaysia doing the retail stuff in Sabah and Sarawak. In Sarawak, it will run by Petros. In Sabah, it will run by SMJ. Okay, now this is crucially important because the state governments of Sabah and Sarawak have to show their own people that we are getting something from the oil and gas resources or business opportunities because we can't claim back the ownership. So this is the best they can do for the next several years. Okay, then I better rush through. So quickly on the Borneo bloc, as I mentioned, they're trying to create this thing called the Borneo bloc. Altogether, in theory, it's 57 MPs. My argument is that it's not possible simply because there's very low level of trust between the political elites of Sabah and Sarawak. In fact, the political elites in Sarawak, GPS, thinks that the Sabahan politicians are mostly cowboys. They can never get the act together. So it will be a bit hard for them to come together, at least for the short future. Right, so in the short run, we will have Sarawak, they'll consolidate themselves under the Sarawak First philosophy. So the political fortress the idea is to create Sarawak as a state within larger federation. They won't allow any of this so-called toxic political culture from Malaya to be imported into Sarawak. In Sabah, slightly different. Because the Muslims are majority in Sabah, we can expect Sabah politics to be more unsettled until the next state election. Basically, MS63 issues, unstoppable. There's no way that you can stop the rise of state nationalism for the reasons I've given just now. Bottom line, federal government will not grant any more autonomy, and they'll definitely not give back oil and gas, but they'll do other things like provide more money. Very important point. Politicians in Sabah and Sarawak do not owe loyalty to any of the political groups in Peninsular Malaysia. Okay? Never forget a very important point. During the 5 days of negotiations to form the federal government, GPS initially wanted to go with Perikatan Nasional, but they were forced to backtrack and go with UNAWA. Okay? So they don't have any loyalties. So if anything happens in Peninsular Malaysia, right, they'll look at which way the wind is blowing and they'll try to go with the winners. So the final word is that GE15, in my point of view, was largely a failure in 2 ways related to Sabah and Sarawak. One was that the voters did not select a clear winner in Peninsular Malaysia. Okay, and this created political instability that forced the royal institutions to get involved. Secondly, as my colleague has mentioned, the rise of PAS has meant a fundamental challenge. So is the green wave a permanent wave, or is it really an anti-Zahid vote, anti-Najib vote? Okay, and we'll find out very soon because the state elections are coming. But the bottom line for Sabah Sarawak is this. If federal politics is not stable, you cannot expect political stability in Sabah and Sarawak because everything is linked together. But ironically, if you have a very, very strong and stable federal government, the Sabahans and Sarawakians will also be unhappy because it means that they will ignore Sabah and Sarawak on autonomy issues as well. So you have to strike a very fine balance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If I can invite you both to take